This week on the APUSHow, we're looking at Chapter 29, Civil Rights, Vietnam, and the Ordeal of Liberalism. We'll look at the expanding liberal state. I wonder if that means, maybe it just means the state of Illinois got bigger because it conquered another state like Iowa or Indiana. We'll look at the battle for racial equality. Sheesh, it's about time there was a battle for racial equality. Man, I bet you that never happened in the United States before the 1960s. We'll also look at the quote-unquote flexible responses to the Cold War. Sheesh, I hope it was flexible as William Howard Taft over here, because he is quite flexible. We'll also look at the agony of Vietnam. Not really anything cheeky or fun to say about the agony of Vietnam, because it was very, very agonizing for a lot of people the world over. And lastly, we'll look at the traumas of 1968. Sheesh, there were multiple traumas. Sounds like it was a really rough year, and I would know a thing or two about rough years, as would William Howard Taft. All this and more this week on the APUSHow. We begin our chapter on the 1960s with an examination of what is known as the expansion of the liberal state, as we see a return of the Democratic Party to positions of power within Congress and the White House, as they would continue the agenda that they had taken during the New Deal and during World War II of a very involved federal government in the affairs of American society. Some Americans saw this as a relief, as many criticized the Eisenhower administration of the 1950s as sort of standing idly by while issues of poverty and racism only worsened. But as we shall see as the decade wore on, more and more people disagreed with this idea of an involved federal government, as the Democrats would slowly but surely lose power. Of course, you can't really begin an examination of the political scene of the 1960s without first examining the presidency and personality of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Kennedy was the handsome, articulate, and young by presidential standards son of a wealthy American ambassador to Britain who himself had amassed a heavily influential family on his own right. Kennedy would narrowly win the Democratic nomination for president on a platform that called for energetic progress and personal sacrifice in the name of reform. He would campaign on a New Deal type program that he would call the New Frontier, which involved government programs aimed to help alleviate issues pertaining to poverty. Running against him was another relatively young candidate in Richard Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president. He would run on more moderate reform, but would narrowly lose to Kennedy, mostly because of Kennedy's personality and charm, which had a much bigger impact on a presidential campaign, as the 1960 election was perhaps the first widely televised presidential election and campaign. However, despite his speeches, his good looks, and his seemingly perfect American family, Kennedy found his ability to pass his New Frontier agenda incredibly difficult, as a coalition of Republicans and conservative Democrats in Congress obstructed most of his policy efforts. But most of his political capital was built on his personality, which made his assassination all the more tragic for the nation. On November 22, 1963, during a parade in Dallas, Texas, Kennedy was assassinated by a gunman using a high-powered rifle from a building overlooking the parade. The alleged gunman, a confused and embittered veteran by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, would be arrested but would be mysteriously gunned down himself by a nightclub owner by the name of Jack Ruby. Vice President Lyndon Johnson would be sworn in, and a federal commission headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren would investigate the assassination. The Warren Commission would conclude that Oswald and Ruby had acted alone, but over time, more and more Americans began to believe that the Warren Commission ignored evidence and that perhaps a greater conspiracy was at play. And I don't really have the time or energy, and neither does Taft, to get into the vast spectrum of conspiracy theories as to why and how Kennedy got assassinated, whether it was what the Warren Commission said, whether it was some sort of nefarious Russian plot, whether it was some sort of mafia exacting vengeance scenario, or maybe it was aliens, or maybe it was Richard Nixon. We don't quite know, but what we do know is that after the Warren Commission, many Americans distrusted the official American government statement and therefore growingly distrusted the American government. What is also known is that though it is highly unlikely, it's also not impossible to determine if Taft wasn't involved in the Kennedy assassination. Taft, anything to add? Interesting. Sounds pretty guilty to me. The man who succeeded Kennedy was his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. Johnson and Kennedy could not have been more different in terms of their upbringing, as Kennedy was the elite East Coast, Harvard-educated son of an ambassador, and Johnson was, in a very literal sense, a hillbilly from West Texas who started his career as a teacher before he got into politics. But though Johnson was very different from his predecessor in terms of his upbringing, he did share the same mindset Kennedy had, that the federal government must play an active role in improving American lives. Johnson would pass a massive series of reforms known as the Great Society, and he would do it using his almost legendary ability to persuade congressmen to help him get what he wanted. Before he was vice president, Johnson was the Speaker of the House, mostly because of his ability and mostly psychotic drive to get others to do what he wanted and support his efforts. Whether he had to bully, blackmail, cajole, canoodle, flatter, or flummox, Johnson was a master at building a coalition in Congress. However, his main efforts in 1963 were focused on winning re-election in 1964. And because the Republican Party fell under control of the more further right-wing influence of Barry Goldwater, Johnson was able to win easily as he captured the largest portion of the popular vote with 61%, a feat that remains still unmatched to this day. In addition to winning the presidency, Democrats also won back Congress, which allowed Johnson to pass and initiate almost every facet of the Great Society initiative. One of Johnson's earliest efforts was to try and solve the long-standing issue of poverty. Johnson's assault on poverty was the most ambitious effort taken by the U.S. government since the New Deal, and much like the New Deal, had a great deal of success, but also a large degree of unfinished business, as many of the efforts required a greater commitment or fell apart due to perceived and real instances of corruption. Perhaps the most important social welfare program of the Johnson administration was the passage of Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare was a federal program that covered the medical expenses of elderly Americans. This program is still alive and kicking today, and what made it successful early on was that because it was given to everyone regardless of income, it was not perceived as welfare, and it allowed people to keep their doctors. The only difference was that once the medical bill was given to patients, the government covered the cost rather than people themselves or their insurance companies. In 1966, Johnson would pass the Medicaid program, which sought to extend Medicare to all welfare recipients so they would be able to receive health care as well. Johnson would also pass the Community Action Program, but his program did not experience the same relatively smooth rollout as Medicare and Medicaid. Community Action was an effort to create jobs by allowing people of poor communities to plan and execute programs designed to assist their communities. The idea was that people should be able to choose how to help their own communities and gain valuable political and administrative experience in the process. However, the program proved unable to sustain itself due to early administrative failures, along with a few instances of excessive, perhaps corrupt spending in certain areas. Because of these shortfalls, along with the program's perceived lack of efficacy, the office that created it, the Office of Economic Opportunity, ended community action programs. However, years later, we would see many people of color rise to positions of leadership within their communities due to their early experiences working with the Community Action Program. During the anti-poverty program of Kennedy's administration, the federal government would also focus heavily on improving decaying urban centers as well as America's schools. The Housing Act of 1961 sought to improve mass transit systems, preserve open spaces like parks, and subsidize middle-income housing. However, nothing was done regarding subsidizing low-income housing. Kennedy and later Johnson would both work to increase federal aid to public schools, but faced a great deal of opposition as many people resisted further federal involvement in schools, and the issue of whether or not to provide taxpayer money to private religious schools was also a major issue. But under the Johnson administration, federal funding would increase from $5 billion to $12 billion between 1964 and 1967, as funds would both be issued to private and public schools based on the economic conditions of students. The Immigration Act of 1965 would also be a watershed moment in federal immigration policy. The law effectively ended restrictions on immigration, which essentially restricted migration by non-white immigrants to the United States. Though the law ensured a tight limit of only 170,000 persons admitted a year, it placed equal limitations on migrants from Africa, Europe, and Asia. However, migration from certain parts of Latin America were still restricted due to fears of communist infiltration, as well as complex pseudo-imperialist relationships between the United States and those Central and South American countries. Johnson's Great Society programs were an ambitious attempt to solve issues regarding poverty and equity within the United States. The legacy of these programs, like almost all historical legacies, are a mixed bag of success and failures. What ultimately doomed most of the Great Society initiatives was how expensive they were. Great Society programs helped to nearly double the federal budget at the time, and when you factor in the rising cost of the Vietnam War, the federal government could not sustain both. And Taff, what do you think the government chose to spend its money on? Helping impoverished American citizens or working to destroy our enemies? You are correct, but your enthusiasm for destruction is a touch unsettling, sir. Many Great Society programs are also far less effective than hoped, which caused many Americans to accept the mindset that government programs designed to try and improve society were all inherently corrupt and flawed, and no such attempt should be made by the government ever again. However, the Great Society did have some successes. A huge amount of poor and elderly people now received health care when before they would have been left to get sick and die. Also, a vast amount of people were able to climb out of poverty. Now, to be fair, one could also argue that America's relative economic prosperity played a massive role in improving poverty rates. But Great Society programs did help distribute wealth in a more even fashion. In the 1960s, American poverty rates decreased overall by about 42%. However, we see that white poverty rates would narrowly decrease at larger rates than black poverty, and that white poverty decreased by 44% and black poverty decreased by only 42%. Unfortunately, like many of the New Deal programs that preceded it, the Great Society programs also worked to further entrench and embed American systems of racism and subjugation thanks to government funding, especially when it comes to housing. Just like every waking moment in American history previous, the 1960s was also a very racist time to be alive. But unlike at any point in American history before, with the exception of maybe the Civil War, widespread resistance to racist beliefs and systems became more intense and frequent. Black Americans would lead the charge to achieve the most important, urgent, and perhaps most difficult effort our nation has ever taken: the effort to achieve a more racially just and equitable society. However, the concept of de facto segregation has proven to be somewhat problematic in that it absolves the government's role in segregating American society. The early 1960s saw a huge growth in momentum in favor of integration and equality as movements of protests and resistance against the forces obstructing integration and equality would increase. Interestingly enough, this was all done with very little government support, as the Kennedy administration expressed support for racial justice but committed very little action to it. Kennedy would be helpful in some regards, as he freed Martin Luther King Jr. when he was jailed and stepped in from time to time when Southern governments and citizens resisted court-ordered civil rights efforts. But Kennedy hesitated and dithered on many other occasions, as he was fearful of alienating Southern Democrats who resisted integration but helped him win the presidency. So without a great deal of presidential support at the time, the civil rights movement would have to sustain itself from a ground-up approach, which it did thanks to a powerful grassroots movement of resistance and protest. After black students staged a famous sit-in at a segregated restaurant in Greensboro, North Carolina in February of 1960, similar demonstrations would follow throughout much of the South. Many of the leaders of these sit-ins and demonstrations would then form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, to help sustain the movement of resistance. In this same spirit, an interracial group of students would work with the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, to start the Freedom Rides in 1961. Freedom rides were actually a tactic first employed by CORE in the 1940s, but essentially activists would travel by bus to various places in the segregated South to demonstrate and protest for change, especially when it came to segregated transportation accommodations. Their first target would be to integrate bus stations, and they would often be met with savagely brutal resistance from racist whites they encountered. But thanks in large part to these grassroots efforts, President Kennedy would order the forced integration of bus stations across the country. SNCC workers would then mobilize the South to help educate Southern blacks on how to register to vote and participate in the electoral process. To help civil rights activists be more effective and to ensure African Americans knew their rights within the American system, a powerful grassroots leader within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference named Ella Baker helped to create and lead citizen education programs to train and mobilize and embolden ordinary black citizens to resist and challenge segregation and disenfranchisement. Of course, counter movements sprang up everywhere to resist the efforts of civil rights activists. One of the most intense and famous centers of resistance came in Birmingham, Alabama. In what would gain worldwide attention, peaceful demonstrations would be violently and brutally broken up by the Birmingham Police Department under the leadership of Eugene Bull Connor. The world would watch in horror as policemen in the United States would beat nonviolent protesters with clubs, shock them with cattle prods, loose police dogs, and spray fire hoses against protesters, some of whom were small children. In addition to this, Alabama citizens, as well as the governor George Wallace, would again attempt to physically block black students from entering schools and universities that were ordered to be integrated. The 1960s was a violently pendulous period in which progress towards racial justice and equality would almost always be met by the brutal resistance of racist Southern whites. We see this duality on the evening of June 12, 1963, when on the very same night that federal marshals and Attorney General Robert Kennedy traveled to the University of Alabama to force the integration of that institution, NAACP leader Medgar Evers would be murdered in Mississippi by a member of a white supremacist group. These events in Alabama and Mississippi generated massive worldwide scrutiny to the issues surrounding racial equality in the United States, which would force the president to act. As a result, President Kennedy would speak in regards to the moral issues surrounding civil rights and, more importantly, would introduce a series of bills aimed at ending segregation in stores, restaurants, theaters, and hotels, ending racial discrimination in employment, and allowing the federal government to file suit on behalf of school integration. To generate support for the president's proposals and to demonstrate the growing power and magnetism of the civil rights movement, more than 200,000 demonstrators would march on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in August of 1963 for the now famous March on Washington. At this same march, Martin Luther King Jr. would give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which many argue was the peak of the peaceful civil rights movement. But the assassination of President Kennedy a few months later would cause greater urgency to pass meaningful civil rights legislation. Kennedy's civil rights bill had stalled in the Senate thanks to obstruction by Southern segregationist senators, but thanks to skillful public and private pressure provided by Lyndon Johnson, the most meaningful civil rights bill in our nation's history would be passed in the early months of 1964. After making massive gains in terms of integrating numerous spaces throughout the country, the civil rights movement then shifted its focus on voting rights in the summer of 1964. In a similar spirit to the Freedom Rides of 1961, the Freedom Summer of 1964 was an effort where an integrated force of activists would be bussed down to the South, especially Mississippi, to help educate, register, and mobilize Southern black citizens to vote. The Freedom Summer met a great deal of intensely violent white opposition, as 3 of the first freedom workers, 2 of them white, 1 of them black, would be brutally murdered by Ku Klux Klan members with the support of local police in Neshoba County, Mississippi. The Freedom Summer would also see the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP, which was led by activist Fannie Lou Hamer as an alternative to the white-dominated Democratic Party of the state. Rather than continue to challenge the Mississippi Democratic Party, the MFDP would be asked to observe from the sidelines with the promise of future reforms. In March of 1965, Martin Luther King would organize the famous march in Selma, Alabama to grant blacks the right to vote. Very similar to Birmingham, Alabama, demonstrators would again be brutally beaten by police while the event was broadcast throughout the nation and the world. In addition to this, 2 northern whites participating in the march would be later murdered. One of the victims, a minister, was beaten to death in the streets of Selma, and the other, a Detroit housewife, was shot on a highway while driving with a black passenger. These events outraged Americans and would help push President Johnson to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which would provide federal protection for blacks wishing to exercise their right to vote. But as important as these gains were, they still did not succeed in fully satisfying the demand for racial equality, as civil rights activists would demand economic equality rather than only political equality. The movement for civil rights is often associated with the South and exposing and resisting systems of racism that occurred there, but one must remember that the United States had been undergoing major demographic shifts throughout the early 20th century. As a result, many African American communities in northern industrial cities would swell, and as these communities grew, so did the realization that many of the issues of systemic racism one saw in the South were present in the North as well. Civil rights activists in the summer of 1966 began to target these northern cities in an effort to resist what was known as de facto segregation. De jure segregation is segregation by law, meaning separating people by race was written into law. De facto segregation is segregation by practice, like residential patterns. Your textbook doesn't mention this, but what we think of as de facto segregation or segregation by attitude or practice is largely a myth when we think of the government's role in segregating public housing, redlining urban areas by race, or constructing massive highways which further work to isolate communities of color from their white counterparts. We also see the government take an active role in further reinforcing segregated racial patterns through tax policies, willful neglect, and, of course, policing strategies. When you examine the role the government played in keeping certain communities poor and brown and other communities wealthy and white, you see that the idea of American law being fair and impartial in the post-Jim Crow world in terms of keeping America segregated is nothing short of a lie. But though it is true that racism was much less explicit in the North, it was just as evident in the economic sense in the North and the South, as black unemployment was doubled compared to whites, and nearly half of non-white people live below the poverty line. Activists like Martin Luther King would focus their efforts on combating economic racial inequality, but found very little success. Though affirmative action programs did help end some racist hiring and admissions practices, large-scale efforts like Martin Luther King Jr.'s effort to expose and demonstrate against housing and employment discrimination in Chicago was largely a failure, as vicious and sometimes violent resistance from white Chicagoans, along with national indifference to the movement, would ultimately doom the economic aspect of the civil rights movement. But as racial injustice in the political, social, cultural, and economic sense became exposed to a much greater degree, so did the threat of urban violence, as numerous industrial cities would see intensely violent and explosive outbreaks within their largely poor black and brown communities. One of the early and most famous incidents would occur in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts, when a routine traffic stop would result in a black bystander being beaten by a policeman. The incident would spark an explosion of violence and anger that had been bubbling in the black community for decades due to countless interactions with racist policing, stagnant if not worsening levels of financial wealth, and few outlets of escape from the dreary urban existence faced by black citizens in Los Angeles. After a week's worth of rioting, looting, and violence, 34 were dead, 28 of them black. Similar uprisings would occur between 1966 and 1968 in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, as many blighted and impoverished African American neighborhoods would erupt in frustration and violence. As a result, the American resolve in the civil rights movement began to wane, as many white Americans saw the violence as proof that African American communities were more interested in violence than equality, whereas others saw the violence as proof of a need for more meaningful assistance and empowerment to those within these communities. However, it's important to note these outbursts of violence were in many ways a reflection of the violence blacks had been enduring from racist whites and racist police practices for decades before the 1960s and during the 1960s. As violence and resistance against civil rights activists continued to intensify throughout the 1960s, the movement began to change itself as more and more advocates for civil rights moved away from nonviolent protests and more towards the more confrontational Black Power movement, which advocated for racial distinctiveness and self-reliance within the black community. Black Power referred to many different movements that advocated not merely for racial integration, but for empowerment of the black community both inside and out. Proponents of Black Power would often reject integration as a means of destroying black culture and practice a philosophy that sought to embrace and embolden black lives and black culture. Black Power advocates would often wear more traditional African clothing, would adopt African names, would embrace the importance of black music, art, and literature, would push for black studies in schools, and would wear Afro hairstyles that embraced black life rather than straightening one's hair to look more white. Perhaps the most famous Black Power group would be the Black Panther Party, formed in Oakland, California. Black Panther Party chapters would emerge throughout the country as the Black Panthers would project an intensely militant image of armed blacks who aim to empower and protect their community at all costs. It's interesting to note that though they projected a threatening image, far more violence was inflicted upon the Panthers than inflicted by the Panthers themselves. Black Power advocates would soon take over significant portions of pre-existing civil rights groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, and even the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as these groups became less interested in the old methods of nonviolence, became increasingly confrontational, and more prone to act violently towards systems of white supremacy. Perhaps the most recognized figure associated with Black Power would be Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little and had spent his early adult life living as a drug-addicted street hustler and pimp. During a stint in prison, Little became exposed to a group known as the Nation of Islam. Often referred to by many Americans as the Black Muslims, the group advocated for black empowerment and held its members to strict codes of behavior that prohibited drinking, drugs, sex outside of marriage, as well as dietary restrictions. In this group, Malcolm Little found his calling as a leader of the black community. He would reject his last name of Little, as it was the name given to his enslaved ancestors, and replace it with X. He found that he also had remarkable abilities to organize and speak to the black community that few have demonstrated before or since. Like other Black Power leaders, Malcolm X would speak a message of black empowerment and advocated for blacks to defend themselves against violent attacks by any means necessary. Critics often interpreted this to mean that Malcolm X advocated violence, but in his speeches and his writings, we see this to be untrue. Malcolm would be assassinated in 1965, though much like the Kennedy assassination, who was responsible for orchestrating the assassination is still unclear. Most have presumed he was executed because of rivalries and jealousies within the Nation of Islam. Others have presumed it was a more nefarious and clandestine effort of the United States government, in particular the FBI or CIA. Regardless of who was behind his assassination, X's legacy has remained as strong as ever, as he is still to this day perhaps as revered a figure of the civil rights movement as Martin Luther King Jr. And here we take a look at the approaches taken by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations towards foreign policy. And we'll also see a lot of parallels between foreign policy and domestic policy taken by both administrations. And much like their domestic policies, we'll see these liberal agendas take a very optimistic and active role in foreign policy, as both administrations would try to actively shape a vision for America's role in the world. However, much like their domestic policies, we'll see that these policies are actually incredibly difficult to maintain, as a growing number of Americans would become more and more disillusioned and disinterested in the liberal idea of America's place in the world. The Kennedy administration sought to take a more flexible and diversified approach towards foreign policy compared to the Eisenhower administration. You may remember that under the influence of John Foster Dulles, American foreign policy as it pertained to the Cold War involved heavy use of intimidation and threat of nuclear weapons. Not wishing to use such a heavy-handed foreign policy, Kennedy sought a more flexible response that would involve both specialized military forces as well as increased funding in order to help fight communism in the area where Kennedy felt it was most likely to spread: poor, underdeveloped nations that had recently been decolonized, also known as the Third World. Kennedy would happily use highly trained military forces like the Green Berets as well as the CIA to undermine communist efforts in the Third World, and he would also use foreign aid to help repair broken relationships with Third World countries. However, perhaps his greatest failure in foreign policy came in the disaster of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. Cuba, as you may remember, had been taken over by communists led by Fidel Castro, and in order to try and take it back, Kennedy would continue a plan created by the Eisenhower administration that tried to train 2,000 Cuban exiles to land at the Bay of Pigs, and with the aid of air support from the United States Air Force, would lead a successful insurrection of the communist government in Cuba. Well, the air support was never provided, and the insurrection never occurred. The Bay of Pigs was almost a disaster from the start, and Kennedy bailed on the plan, thus leaving the 2,000 exiled Cubans completely out to dry after they invaded the Bay of Pigs. The revolution was crushed, and the Kennedy administration was rightfully humiliated as a result. But Kennedy's confrontation with the communist world was not limited to the sphere of the Third World. There would be occasions for heated exchanges between the United States and the Soviet Union directly. After the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy met with Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the Austrian city of Vienna. The exchange did not go particularly well, as Khrushchev was upset that Americans supported non-communist West Berlin, which was attracting greater numbers of East Berliners who were fleeing en masse across the very traversable border between the two sections of the city. To remedy this, the Soviets would construct a massive wall with heavily armed guards ready to shoot any East Berliner who dared try and cross over to the west side of Berlin. The famous Berlin Wall would stand as a stark symbol of the division between the non-communist world of the West and the communist world of the East. However, Kennedy's confrontations with the Soviets almost turned the Cold War into a full-on hot war in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. After surveillance footage discovered that the Soviets were building underground missile silos in Cuba for the purpose of offensive nuclear attacks on American soil, Americans and the Kennedy administration were outraged that the Soviets would do such a thing, even though there were American missile silos in Turkey for the purpose of offensive nuclear attacks on Russian soil. To try and stop this, Kennedy initiated a naval blockade of Cuba and prepared an air attack on the Cuban missile silos. A full-on war seemed imminent until a message from Khrushchev indicated that the Russians would remove the missile bases if Americans agreed to no longer invade Cuba. Kennedy agreed, and the crisis was over. When Johnson took over for the assassinated Kennedy, it was evident that he lacked significant foreign policy experience. In order to try and prove himself as a strong and capable leader, he sought opportunities to prove himself just as capable as his predecessor in pushing to contain the spread of communism and pursue American interests abroad. His first opportunity would arise in the Dominican Republic, as various factions struggled to control the country after the assassination of dictator General Rafael Trujillo in 1961. When a leftist movement led by nationalist Juan Bosch seemed poised to take over the country, Johnson stepped in and with 30,000 American troops was able to prevent this from happening. Johnson's worry was that Bosch would establish a pro-Castro and pro-Soviet regime in the Dominican Republic. However, there was very little evidence that Bosch would actually have done this. When Bosch was defeated in the 1966 election by a more conservative and America-friendly candidate, Johnson withdrew troops. Johnson somewhat hoped and assumed that other Third World conflicts would play much in the same fashion as the Dominican Republic. Vietnam would prove that to be false. And this, of course, leads us to a rather agonizing discussion of America's war in Vietnam. George Kennan, the man responsible for the policy of containment that would essentially lead to America's involvement in Vietnam, would call it the most disastrous undertaking in the 200 years of America's history. Needless to say, Vietnam was a mess and is now largely regarded as perhaps one of our nation's greatest humiliations in terms of foreign policy. We'll see how the United States first initially got involved in this conflict, how our involvement grew over the years, and how this conflict would reshape America's sense of its own self. For much of its history, Vietnam was a mostly independent country in Southeast Asia, oftentimes functioning as a provincial state for China. During the second wave of European imperialism in the mid to late 19th century, France colonized Vietnam and would rule over the country until Japan took control in World War II. Once Japan was defeated in 1945, France naturally expected to retake Vietnam as they considered it a key piece to their empire. However, there were powerful nationalist movements within Vietnam determined to make the country independent once again. The United States supported its ally France as France tried to regain control of Vietnam in the First Indochina War beginning in 1946. At certain points, nearly 80% of France's military supplies were either made by or paid for by the United States. However, the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, known as the Viet Minh, would prove too much for the French. The leader of the Viet Minh, the Paris and Moscow educated communist Ho Chi Minh, proved to be an incredibly capable leader, and after the French defeat in the battle at Dien Bien Phu in 1953, the French Indochina War was over with the Vietnamese victorious and the French defeated. In 1954, at an international conference in Geneva, originally called to settle the dispute in Korea, an attempt was also made to settle the issue of Vietnam. The Geneva Conference agreed to temporarily split the country in half at the 17th parallel or line of latitude, with the communist Viet Minh in control of the north and a pro-Western regime in the south until an election in 1956 to determine the government that would rule the whole country would be held. After the Geneva Conference, France officially pulled out of Vietnam, and the United States would attempt to step in its place as a sort of imperial manager of the country. The United States would become the main supporter of South Vietnam and its aristocratic Catholic leader, Ngo Dinh Diem. With a large deal of support from the CIA, Diem successfully defeated challenges to his authority from various religious sects as well as the Vietnamese mafia. Though he ruled over South Vietnam quite effectively, he knew full well that he would never win an election that spanned the North and South. So, with American support, Diem ignored the provision of the Geneva Conference that called for an election in 1956. Well, we do like democracy sometimes, Taft, but we don't really like it when we lose. When we lose in democracy, we call it a populist mob trying to undo the free fabric of American society. And that's when we have to make certain foreign countries unfree in order to maintain our own freedom. And yes, Diem refused to allow elections because he knew he would lose to Ho Chi Minh. So rather than allow the people to decide the fate of his nation, he instead would go after Viet Minh elements within South Vietnam with a large degree of initial success. So much success that Ho Chi Minh resumed his armed struggle for national unity and would push Southern Viet Minh to establish the National Liberation Front, or NLF. Later on, Americans would know the NLF as the Viet Cong. By 1961, military operations of the NLF were effectively destabilizing the Diem government, and later on, it would be Diem's own brutal policies that would be his own undoing. In an effort to make Catholicism the dominant religion of Vietnam, Diem would go after South Vietnamese Buddhists. In reaction to this, Buddhists would stage massive anti-government demonstrations, and on a few occasions, Buddhist monks would publicly light themselves on fire as a form of protest. Needless to say, these protest movements were enormously effective as the United States began to have second thoughts on their support of the Diem government, but not for South Vietnam itself. In the fall of 1963, President Kennedy gave tacit approval to South Vietnamese generals to overthrow the Diem government, but supposedly to President Kennedy's surprise, they would actually assassinate Diem instead. A few weeks later, Kennedy would also be assassinated. I mean, it's not impossible. You make no sense. Now, as I mentioned previously, when Johnson took over the office of the presidency, he faced a great deal of pressure to continue where Kennedy had left off, and as we saw in Cuba, Kennedy was more than willing to intervene in the affairs of third world nations when it came to suppressing communist movements. When Johnson took over in 1963, American forces were well involved in supporting the South Vietnamese government, and Johnson, along with his advisors, who were mostly Kennedy leftovers, were firmly committed to executing their desire to keep communism out of Vietnam. Also, the preceding 20-ish years of American foreign policy in Latin America, Korea, and Europe all indicated that the United States would be committed to intervene when it came to communist influence. At first, the United States under Johnson only assisted the effort in Vietnam in an advisory capacity, which is very similar to my relationship with Taft in regards to darts, as Taft is my darts advisor. How was that? You're a really mean advisor, Taft. But after August of 1964, American involvement in Vietnam dramatically expanded after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. According to President Johnson, American warships had been attacked by Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin near Vietnam. Though the details of the attack were very suspicious, Johnson presented the attack as completely legitimate and was able to get both the House and the Senate to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with only 2 senators voting against it. Johnson now essentially had free rein to escalate the conflict as he saw fit. And escalate the conflict is exactly what he would do as the United States shifted away from an advisory role to full-blown participant in the Vietnam War. Leadership in South Vietnam was an absolute mess, and without American involvement, the Communist North probably would have taken control in a matter of months, if not weeks. In March of 1965, there were roughly 100,000 American troops stationed in Vietnam. By 1967, there would be over 500,000 troops in Vietnam as the United States engaged in a full-blown military effort, as not only were there 500,000 troops on the ground, but the United States also dropped a greater tonnage of explosives on North Vietnam than all of the bombs that the U.S. dropped in World War II combined. American casualties were also steadily increasing as over 4,000 soldiers lost their lives in the conflict by the spring of 1966. And though the U.S. was able to somewhat establish a stable South Vietnamese government under the leadership of Nguyen Van Due, the Viet Cong under the control of Ho Chi Minh controlled the majority of southern Vietnamese villages. The war in Vietnam quickly became an awkward, complex, and hazardous situation. And what do we call an awkward, complex, and hazardous situation, Taft? That's right, we call it a quagmire. Vietnam was a massive quagmire for the United States, as this was a very unusual war. How do you win a war when the objective is to convince people to not resort to the type of government they want to resort to? The initial strategy was to make it a war of quote unquote attrition. Basically, this means that you cause so much damage and kill so many people that eventually the other side is unwilling and unable to continue. So the US would drop loads of bombs and attack as many targets as they could, but attacking the Viet Cong proved to be exceedingly difficult. One, because Vietnam was such a non-industrialized, agrarian, and jungle-y country, villages were small and military targets were even smaller. Two, the Viet Cong had built an extensive network of tunnels, underground storage facilities, underground shops, and underground munitions factories. Three, the Viet Cong were willing to use way more citizens for their war effort than the US initially anticipated. Four, the Viet Cong got a great deal of help from the Soviets and the Chinese. And five, there were a lot of people in South Vietnam who were also sympathetic to the Viet Cong, so they got help from them too. To try and combat this last piece, the United States tried to win the quote-unquote hearts and minds of the southern Vietnamese, but quickly found they were no match for the Viet Minh, who were much more adept at building meaningful connections with their southern counterparts. Because of this, the United States would then resort to uprooting entire villages to essentially moving them out of the way so they could wage war more effectively. The result was over 3 million Vietnamese being sent to refugee camps as the US would try to uproot and destroy villages in order to save them. As the war progressed and victories seemed to fall further and further out of reach, and reports of failures and atrocities committed by Americans mounted, support for the war at home soon shifted to full-blown opposition. In the early days of the Vietnam War, very few Americans protested or even opposed the war. For many Americans, Vietnam was yet another name of a far-off country in which the United States was intervening in order to prevent the spread of communism. Vietnam was just another Dominican Republic or Guatemala or Korea. However, as the war dragged on and its brutality and futility seemed more and more apparent, full-scale movements and cultures opposing the war emerged by 1967. Beginning largely in college campuses, massive movements, demonstrations, marches, and protests would be staged across the country in opposition to the war. The massive popularity of folk music, and within it another section of music known as protest music against the war, would also indicate the nation's intense disdain for what Johnson called, quote-unquote, this bitch of a war. Young people all across the country knew friends who either enlisted or were drafted to fight and die in a war that many did not believe in and many believed we could not win. The anti-war movement would also spill into politics, as the left wing of the American political spectrum would adopt the war as its largest area of focus and opposition, much to the dismay of civil rights activists. Congressmen like William Fulbright of Arkansas would level public criticism against the Johnson administration and its continued commitment to the war. Former military leaders like James Gavin and George Kennan would also express their opposition to the war. Robert McNamara, Johnson's own Secretary of Defense, who worked tirelessly to extend and increase the war effort, would leave office in 1968 defeated and disillusioned. Adding to the nation's trauma regarding Vietnam was the massive inflation that resulted in large part because of the massive war spending by the federal government. The inflation rate, also known as the rate at which money becomes increasingly worthless, would rise from 2% to 6% between 1965 and 1967. Generally speaking, most economists agree that a healthy rate of inflation is between 1 and 2%. Johnson's government witnessed an inflation rate 3 times as high as the healthy rate, and in order to remedy this situation, Johnson sought to create a 10% tax increase that was rightfully labeled as a war tax. Johnson made the mistake of attempting massive government programs to alleviate poverty and also fight a massive war on the other side of the world, and in order to gain his tax break, one of those programs had to give. In the end, Johnson compromised and reduced his commitment to fighting a war on poverty by $6 billion. His financial commitment to fighting a war in Vietnam, on the other hand, remained stronger than ever. And in our last section of our examination of the 1960s, we look at the year 1968, which is described by your book as traumatic. And in many ways, it was traumatic, as the United States seemed to grow more and more frustrated with stalled efforts to achieve civil rights for all Americans, regardless of race, and our efforts in Vietnam seemed to grow more and more hopeless with no clear sign of victory in sight. As tensions and assassinations mounted, violent outbursts across the country grew more and more frequent as many Americans expressed a greater desire to return to order and normalcy, even if that sense of normal is what led to those tensions and violent outbursts in the first place. In the social and political sense, America effectively lost the war in terms of public support with the Tet Offensive on January 31st, 1968. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and many American soldiers assumed the Viet Cong would not engage in any attacks on that day. Well, they were wrong. The communist forces successfully caught American forces by surprise and were able to take numerous cities under their control. Americans would watch their televisions in horror as Americans would flee the American embassy in Saigon, and as horrific acts of violence that had become commonplace in the war were now broadcast on TV for the nation to see. Ironically enough, Tet was rather catastrophic for the National Liberation Front, as the American counterattack would not only retake essentially everything the NLF had won, but they would also lose a staggering amount of soldiers in the process, forcing the war to be largely fought by the North Vietnamese rather than Southern Vietnamese communists. Yet despite these victories for the American military, support for the war effort at home was at the point of being irreparable, as Americans for the most part felt politically and psychologically defeated in Vietnam. As the presidential election of 1968 approached, left-wing and anti-war Democrats looked to promote a candidate who would challenge the sitting president and Democrat Lyndon Johnson. They would first ask New York Senator and brother of slain President John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, but he declined their invitation. They would then ask Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, who accepted and would show an early lead over the president in the primary elections leading up to the '68 general election. But Robert Kennedy would enter the race later on, along with his powerful coalition of support within the African American community, the working class, and within organized labor. President Johnson lagged behind Robert Kennedy badly, and animosity towards the president was so intense he wouldn't even dare to leave the White House, let alone campaign. On March 31st, Johnson would not only give in to anti-war protests by halting air attacks in Vietnam for a time, but he would also announce his withdrawal from the election in 1968. With a heated political battle in the election of 1968 gaining greater intensity, issues regarding racial tensions would also refocus the nation in April of 1968. While in Memphis, Tennessee, to lend support to striking African American sanitation workers, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated while on the balcony of his hotel. The alleged gunman was a man named James Earl Ray, who would really have no clear motive to assassinate King, though evidence indicates he may have been hired to do so. Who may have hired him is still unknown to this day. The nation grieved the loss of the most iconic civil rights leader in the history of the nation, but many factions within the African American community were enraged to the point of explosive violence as riots broke out in over 60 American cities, resulting in the deaths of 43 people, the arrests of 27,000 people, and injuries to over 3,000 more. 2 months later, with the nation still grieving the loss of King, still processing the ongoing war in Vietnam, still processing the lack of progress in civil rights, and perhaps still processing the loss of President Kennedy, Kennedy's brother Robert would be assassinated in a California hotel ballroom after declaring victory in the California primary. His assassin was a Palestinian named Sirhan, who was enraged over pro-Israel remarks the president had made earlier. Many Americans found the assassination of Robert Kennedy to be particularly shattering, as Kennedy resonated extremely well with people of color and the working class. In Robert Kennedy, many identified the most with the idea of the Kennedy legacy, which was an idea of using the power of the government to help and empower those who were the most powerless. With Kennedy now assassinated, Vice President Hubert Humphrey was the main viable Democratic candidate with virtually no opposition. With Humphrey's acceptance of his nomination to run as the Democratic candidate for president looming imminently at the Democratic National Convention of 1968 in Chicago, the nation fully expected an event riddled with protests. Protesters did not disappoint, as massive demonstrations and protests within the city of Chicago would escalate for days as the convention dragged on. On the third night of the convention, tensions bubbled over as protesters would clash with the Chicago Police Department. The nation watched as intense scenes of violence were broadcast all over the country as protesters chanted, "The whole world is watching," as they were brutally beaten and tear-gassed by the police. In one of the most famous public speaking screw-ups in recent American history, Chicago Mayor Richard Daley would say, "The police are not here to create disorder, they're here to preserve disorder." Oops. In the midst of all of this trauma and chaos, Humphrey would receive his nomination, but his chances of winning an election against the Republicans seemed doomed to failure. With America in a state of turmoil, some feared that the country was on the brink of some sort of massive leftist revolution. The reality was that many of the conservative elements of the country never went away and were just as entrenched as ever. One of the more glaring examples of the continued presence of conservative ideologies in the late 1960s was the surprising popularity of Alabama Governor George Wallace as a third-party presidential candidate. Wallace was in a lot of ways the embodiment of segregation and was perhaps the antithesis to Martin Luther King Jr. Wallace would boldly promise in a speech, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. However, he was conservative in other aspects besides race as well. Like most conservatives, he was vehemently against government involvement via regulation of society or the economy, and he was harshly critical of the permissiveness of protests and other First Amendment-supported displays against the Vietnam War, race relations, and other problematic aspects of the United States. Wallace did surprisingly well, as many Americans who became labeled as the quote-unquote silent majority yearned for a return to the more seemingly simple times of the past. However, whenever people talk about America's past as a sort of ideal, simpler time, realize that it was only ideal and simple if you were a heterosexual white man. If you were biracial, a person of color, any one of the members of the LGBTQ+ community, or a woman, it was a frustrating and complicated experience at best and a suffocating, violent nightmare at worst. It was pretty whack. The man who would successfully tap into this conservative notion better than anyone else in the late 1960s was Richard Nixon. Nixon's career as a politician seemed just about dead after he lost the 1960 election, but Nixon found himself to be relevant thanks to his continued commitment to running a campaign dedicated to supporting Americans who were tired of having to worry about helping the poor, tired of having to worry about race relations, and tired of reforms that seemed to only help criminals. He would promote a vision of America in which Americans were free to do what they want, even if what they wanted was to continue to live in a society in which people were systemically privileged at the expense of others. But above all else, Nixon would promote himself as the candidate of stability, law, and order who would best promote America's interests as a dominant but peaceful world power. The 1968 election was close, but despite a large surge by Humphrey, Nixon would emerge victorious despite losing a large amount of would-be Republican voters to George Wallace. In a similar vein to Eisenhower, we see the pendulum of American public opinion swing away from seeing government as a necessary agent of social change to seeing government as a provider of safety and order. But how the Nixon-led government would order society would still be based on the same social mechanisms rooted in misogyny and racism. And that about wraps up our discussion of Chapter 29. Tune in next week as we look at the late 1960s and early 1970s, as we look at changes in terms of society, culture, politics, and economics, as more and more Americans began to doubt American authority at all levels, and various forms of resistance would emerge like never before. As always, on behalf of myself and William Howard Taft, thank you all so much for watching, and don't forget, we gotta keep pushing, G. Taft, we did it. You slept through pretty much the whole thing, but we did it. Nice work.